improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition with your host, me, the Iceman, Brad Colbert. And in case you were looking at a calendar, you may not have noticed that this is not the normal slot for our weekly chats. And that is with good reason. Frankly, the protests in Iran have escalated to a level unprecedented, and I wanted to make a visit to everyone and talk a little bit about it. So if you are willing to indulge me with a special edition, I'm willing to deliver it. I have been interested in the protests in Iran since they started. They have not only piqued my interest, but the interest of the world, specifically because of the intensity of these protests. And of course, everyone is sitting with bated breath, wondering what these protests will result. Could it mean regime change? Or is it more of a never-ending cycle of protests and retaliation until we return back to the status quo? So much so that I looked into it with deep intensity over the past several days and came up with a conclusion that kind of countermanded something that I had said before, which was I didn't think regime change was possible based off U.S. kinetic strikes. And I had to eat some humble pie as I looked into the situation a little more deeply. So let's get in it. And along the way, as always, I will be nursing some libations. Tonight's is Port Charlotte, which is a 10-year-old Islay single malt scotch. It's smoky, it's peaty, it's delicious. So pour yourself a glass of your preferred spirit and indulge me while we go down the rabbit hole in Iran. So as I said, I have been watching these protests from the beginning, as I would imagine most of you are. Now, this is a country who is able to have significant reach through their proxies far beyond their borders and has terrorized, literally and figuratively, the Western world and all of its supporters since the Iranian Revolution back in '79. So, well, all of their proxies have been kind of put on their back heels lately, and they just lost a big one in Venezuela. So last week, there's one less, which is a good thing. And possibly within the next week, there may be one less in Iran. I have been commenting on these protests and the conditions it would take to tip the regime. And the answer to me has always been the same. Unless you can fracture the Iranian Republican Guard, you're not going to get regime change, no matter what the health of the mullah is, supreme leader, whatever you want to call him. Khomeini's death is not necessarily going to spell a coffin nail to the regime. No, you have to, even the elite fracturing isn't enough. You have to get rid of the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, the IRGC. And I've never understood how the United States could do that, even with a kinetic strike, unless the United States truly wants to enter into a regional war that just draws in every able-bodied fighter, much like we saw in Iraq in 2003. There's no way to do it, or so I thought. So looking into this problem, I threw all the paradigms out the window and started from a completely blank slate. I first asked myself, what is the center of gravity of Iran and how do you attack it? And I thought that the center of gravity was the theocracy. The revolution incepted Khomeini, and I thought that would be it, but it's actually not. That is just this political arm, the religious figurehead. I mean, he's not really even the president. There is a separate sitting Iranian president, and none of those things really struck me as being the true center of gravity. No, it's the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, the militant arm of the theocratic institution. It is the enforcer. It is the shadow government. It is the threat that has kept a lot of Western countries from putting boots on the ground and physically toppling this very powerful regime. So how do you attack the Islamic Republican Guard Corps? Because the country of Iran can basically implode before the IRGC fractures. They have such a tight grip on the stability and the security of the country since the revolution, and actually gotten measurably stronger. Well, any other time these protests, I think they would probably come and they would go, and that would be the end of it. The world would wait for a couple of weeks, the protests would die down, state authorities would arrest people, kill plenty of them, and then I think life in Iran would begrudgingly go back to normal. And it kept coming back to the IRGC. And I think that's the answer to this problem. We're going to play a slight hypothetical here, so indulge me. We're going to unroll this in a bit of a 3-act play. And along the way, I'll explain who the actors are, who the protagonists and antagonists are, and then some of those that kind of fall in between. So because these are not normal times, and this is not a normal protest, as I've talked about previously, these protests have a different tone to them. Shouting death to Khomeini, combined with a noticeable lack of fear from the protesters, this is also drawn in a cross-section of Iranians that has never been drawn into a protest before. Typically, it's college students, it's low income, it's the poor, it's those that are disenfranchised. This time, it's the merchant class. That's not done before, and it's also being joined by labor. So you have a cross-section of Iranian society who, by the thousands, are out in the streets, almost from north to south, east to west. The entire country has protesters out verbalizing their discomfort, their disdain for the regime. The inflation is out of control. The real is absolutely collapsed. You're talking massive inflation, a constriction on goods and services, and limited resources. Water being amongst the biggest right now in Iran. Huge water shortage. I know a country next door that has desalination technology, but I don't think the Israelis are too keen on sharing it with the Iranians, at least today. So all of those things has culminated into this perfect storm of protests that the Iranians are struggling to contain, struggling to understand. In the beginning, they took a very conciliatory tone, telling the protesters, I get it. You go ahead and protest. It is your right. Look at us. Look how generous we are. As long as it doesn't tip the scale into a security threat. Well, that lasted for a hot 4 days before suddenly everything was a security threat. So, very unprecedented protest in a very unprecedented time. All of this while America's most brazen and bombastic president in history has the reins of the world's most powerful military and has shown he isn't afraid to use it. Recently putting Iran on notice by saying that if they kill protesters, and spoiler alert, the death toll is up to 2,000 as of this evening, according to a couple of sources, depending on which ones you are most trusting. He said he's going to step in and help the protesters. When that was verbalized, I shrugged it off as hyperbolic, more of a show of solidarity than actual intent. I mean, surely he isn't serious. Then I thought, what if he is? And what if he doesn't want to be called Shirley? So I thought about it and I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't immediately discern, as I said, how the United States would strike to help the protesters. They're not going to land helicopters in the middle of Tehran to evacuate them. They're certainly not going to roll tanks up the street. And it, again, came back to, I mean, barring a Venezuela, style raid, this isn't going anywhere. Not with our assistance anyways, but maybe, just maybe, if it was done right, combined with a few other things, it might just be possible. If you squeeze the regime from the outside and the inside, you might be able to get away with toppling the regime in a couple of months, possibly even sooner. So let's look at this. let's look at what's possible, what could go right, and what could go wrong. So, first, in order to set the stage for this purely hypothetical regime collapse, understand that the situation in Iran, as I have mentioned with the protesters, but more as you'll see, is at a historic boiling point due to a series of escalating events over the last year. Let's revisit some of these. You had strikes last year from Israel and the United States during what is referred to as the 12-day war. That is some of your external threats. Internal, you have huge protests going on right now. 31 provinces, 180 cities, unlike previous waves, driven by a total currency collapse and a chronic resource shortage. Security fatigue. Those that are maintaining security of the protests, either keeping government buildings secure or going in and arresting people, of which tens of thousands of people have been arrested so far, they are fatigued. They're tired. This has been going on for a couple of weeks. It is high intensity work, and the most of the security personnel are low level. I don't want to say entry level wages, but they're not really getting paid robustly, and they are policing neighborhoods that are their own people. So friends, neighbors, family, in some instances, it's not unusual for the security people they're kind of getting burned out. You also have a leadership vacuum in the sense that there are a lot of rumors revolving around the failing health of the supreme leader, Khomeini. And this has created a sense of paralysis at the top, leading to a lot of confusion and a lot of ambiguity about the chain of command during this crackdown. Bouncing back external, once again, a lot of the proxies that Iran has typically had control over, like Hezbollah and Hamas, has been significantly weakened and can't really offer the defense in depth to Iran that historically they would. What has oftentimes kept a lot of Iran's adversaries at bay is the omnipresence of some of these proxies. I mean, look at al-Bashir and the Assad regime in Syria, gone. That Syrian financial cushion was giving Iran a lot of help when the rial tanks and they need to borrow large sums of money. So internally and externally, the last 12 months in Iran has seen unprecedented times, and it has caused a lot of second and third order effects to the regime. So that's the current stage where we are right now. Internal pressures, external weakenings, and some external pressures. They've lost a lot of their proxies. This isn't the Iran from 5 years ago. So let's introduce some of our actors. As I said, the center of gravity for Iran is the Islamic Republican Guard Corps. Goes all the way back to the revolution of 1979, and the original, monarchy was dethroned, exiled, and turned into a theocracy and a, pretty police state driven one at that. Sharia law, very, very conservative Islamic rule, and no funny business, none at all. So they're no longer just a military. The Islamic Republican Guard Corps is truly a shadow state in every sense of the world. They maintain a stranglehold on the Iranian economy, and the primary reason that the regime has survived previous protests was this shadow economy allowed them to fund the security apparatus even when the rial fell. So these Islamic Republican Guard Corps soldiers stand separate from Iran's conventional military. They're not a militia. They are part of the military, but they are an organization in unto themselves. They answer directly to Ayatollah Khomeini, Ali Khomeini, and that's about it. They have gotten so much control over Iran's currency over Iran's money generating capability through oil and other ill-gotten gains, that they generate their own revenue. They can pay bonuses to soldiers and the militia during protests, even if the rial crashes for the general public. So they are able to weather a lot of these storms. They're also the master of this shadow economy, and it makes traditional diplomatic sanctions much less effective. For the past 20 years, they have been funneling a lot of these funds into stable coins, into offshore accounts, a lot of these shell game of currencies that allows them to bypass formal financial sanctions that doesn't weaken the rest of the Iranian government and, by extension, the rest of the Iranian military industrial complex. So essentially, the Republican Guard, and this is important to our overall theory, right? We're introducing our actors. The way that the Islamic Republican Guard Corps generates money is basically three different ways. The first and foremost, no-brainer, it's oil. They're not just the beneficiary of oil wealth, but the primary reseller of it. Direct oil allocations show that in budget documents and intel that's been collected by a couple of different sources, all seem to indicate that IGRC gets the oil from the country of Iran, from their own country, and then they sell it. They're in charge of transferring the bulk of the oil exports directly to sell on their own. So Iran does put out oil in the traditional market, or what limited oil they are allowed to sell, but the bulk of it goes to the IGRC, who puts it on a shadow fleet and sells it on the black market. And their oil exports are expected to reach somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 billion in 2026. That's 50% of the Iranian oil revenue. Half of all money earned in Iran from oil sales is not only brokered by the IGRC, but absorbed by them. That's a huge amount of money that bypasses Iranian's central bank entirely. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is the shadow banking. They utilize a global network of front companies and shadow banks to move all of these funds around, and it makes it very, very difficult for Westerners to sanction and or seize this revenue stream. Cutting the head off the snake, attacking the center of gravity, involves targeting the IGRC's wallet. So first we have to know how their money is earned and then where their money is kept. Whew. And lastly, they have these banyads, which is an Islamic word for foundations. They're kind of like shell companies that control other companies. 40% of Iran's total economy is actually controlled by the IGRC banyads, these military banyad complex. For example, Qatam al-Anyaba is the IGRC's massive engineering and construction conglomerate. It holds thousands of contracts in oil, gas, mining, and infrastructure. And effectively, it makes the IGRC's banyads the largest employer and contractor in Iran. They also run a black market. They have what's called these invisible jetties, or unofficial ports, where they manage the smuggling of contraband, electronics, alcohol. Alcohol. I know that this is something that is not supposed to happen in Islamic countries, but hey, been there. They drink. It's on the down low, but it is one of the great pleasures of that part of the world is they like to smuggle in alcohol. Forbidden fruit. I don't know. Call it what you will. I enjoy my libations in the open, as I'm assuming most of you do as well. So, smuggling, oil, shell companies, all of this generates income, all of this generates control, and it makes the IGRC extraordinarily powerful, kind of like a mafia state. It makes the regime both resilient and brittle all at the same time, though, because you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket. All right. On the protagonist side, the American president, Donald Trump, who is supported by Congress and the American voter, and the loosely formed government in exile of Iran, consisting of the National Coalition of Resistance, as well as the former Crown Prince, Reza. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this gentleman. He is the son of the dethroned monarchy from 79, He's been exiled living in the United States for a long time. And from what I have read, is eager to not only incite riots within Iran, but rally the diaspora of Iranians outside of the country of Iran in the hopes that the country regime will fall. And he is eager and willing to step in. We'll come back to these two in just a moment. Now, the Crown Prince has advocated for a secular democratic republic. He doesn't want to go back to the monarchy from what I've read, but who knows what's going to happen. All of this is great, but you have to have a little more to it than that. You have to have a government in exile who is ready to step in day one should the regime fall. Now, the NCRI, that National Council of Resistance of Iran, it's presenting itself as a parliament in exile. It's advocating for a democratic Islamic republic as well. And I hope that they make good on it, because you're going to need both. You're going to need the Crown Prince, or former Crown Prince, and you're going to need his parliament. And they're going to need to start working on plans for a transitional government, and they have to broadcast those plans within the country. President Trump is the wild card here, because it's hard to predict what his intentions are going to be day to day, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, actually, as we've seen over the last couple of years. But let's take him at his word. Let's say that he will make good on his threats to attack Iran militarily. And over the last 24 to 48 hours, there has been many announcements coming out of the White House that have supported this claim, that he is in fact going to make good on his promises. So let's leave that one where it lies. Let's go on to the American people, and more importantly, Congress, since they control the War Powers Act, as well as the purse, as well as a couple of other powers that the Constitution has enumerated to them. Whether or not they choose to use it is completely outside the scope of this subject. U.S. public opinion on military actions in Iran is deeply divided, as I'm sure you can believe. It falls down into three camps, really: Republicans, Democrats, and independents, okay? Most of the public is war weary, especially regarding new foreign entanglements. A significant majority of the country, the polling shows 74% believes the president should seek Congress's approval before going in and launching new strikes. And interestingly, that includes some Republicans from his own party. And Donald Trump's presidency is unprecedented in and of itself in so many ways, and Congress is lockstep with him. So for members of his own party to offer some, not necessarily resistance, but some pushback, same thing, I suppose, it's unusual. But the Republican electorate suggesting a lingering constitutionist streak, even among some of his base. Democrats clearly, almost to the man, don't want us to engage with Iran, are not looking for strikes, don't advocate for strikes. It's pretty much what you would expect. But the American public, when polled, and there's been a lot of polling recently about this, they generally agree on the goals. They disagree on the means. Sorry, my Port Charlotte went down the wrong pipe. Across the board, bipartisan, they still view Iranian nuclear weapons as a direct threat. And it is. That hasn't abated despite our, last summer's strikes, the 12-day war, as it's being referred to, from strikes from us and strikes from Israel. It damaged their capability, but it didn't wipe it off the board. And since then, they have not allowed the International Atomic Energy Commission to go in and inspect. So we don't really know, not officially. 80% of voters still express concern that striking oil terminals would lead to a wider and uncontrollable regional war. Our country's inflation is running right about 2.7. Compare that with Iran, who's almost at 50%. Our issues are inflation, and our issues are healthcare. many fear that hitting Iranian oil is going to have a direct pain at the pump. And they're right. It's going to. Even just the threat is enough to drive oil prices up and constrict the markets. There is not been or has not been that flood of Venezuelan oil to offset anything that takes place in the market. We're still hovering around $70 a barrel. Last I looked, it may have adjusted during the time of this broadcast. And if so, I apologize, but estimates are $70 a barrel. And Venezuela is about a year away from releasing the quantity of oil to bring the prices down to the $50 a barrel price point. So no matter what we do in Iran today, you're going to feel the pain at the pump probably for the rest of this year, definitely in the summer. 85% from what I read of Democrats are opposed to strikes against Iran. 60% of independents both fear that they're going to be drawn into another forever war. We are still in Iraq, although small. Clearly, we bailed on Afghanistan, fuckers. So, yeah, the national average, 42, 44% support strikes, and the rest don't. Now, there is one notable exception in the polling. The notable exception to the anti-war sentiment is the humanitarian angle. And I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of what the administration has been targeting in the press releases has been, don't kill the protesters, allow the protesters to be peaceful, respect human rights, don't beat people, don't unnecessarily detain them. And all of that is beautiful packaging because it really plays up the humanitarian angle. And recent polling shows that if the IRGC begins violently killing protesters on a mass scale, support for a surgical intervention increases about 10 to 15 points across the board. That's pretty good. And I think that's why the administration has leveraged framing potential strikes as a moral imperative rather than just a strategic one. And this is going to be important. So keep this point in mind. So we do have other players, as I am sure you're aware. And you're probably saying, what about China? What about Russia? What about Israel? What about Middle Eastern countries? Well, all of these will make an appearance in our little play in situ. So hang on, we will get to them when their turn comes. The likelihood of this regime toppling, it's higher than at any point in the last 40 years, but it's not a certainty. And most experts agree the regime will only fall if military and security forces fragment, and I agree wholeheartedly. The Republican Guard's power is financial. Their ability to pay mid to lower level soldiers. If external strikes, and this is my big ta-da, if external strikes were to target their financial heart, the invisible jetties, the oil terminals, and the IRGC-owned businesses, they would lose their ability to fund the very people holding their line against the protesters. All while the protesters maintain the avalanche in the streets, now the probability of a systemic breakdown or a military coup by, let's say, spring becomes a serious possibility. The Kark Island oil refinery is almost entirely in the IGRC's control. There's a couple of other ones, so we know exactly where they are. We know exactly how to hit them. Their shadow fleet has been tracked by the U.S. We know exactly when they leave port, where they're going. The one that was captured coming out of Venezuela that ostensibly had a Russian flag, well, that's one of those shadow fleet tankers. It started its journey in Iran and then went into Venezuela and then into our hands from there. So this is a path that I'm describing. It's a narrow path, but we could widen it by targeting their financial holdings in the same way that we targeted, well, any narco-terrorist or any terrorist organization, or basically anyone that has money and keeps it in a bank. They're not keeping $13 billion under their mattress, so that money is going somewhere. I'd be willing to bet that between the Treasury Department, Secret Service, a couple of other government organizations, we probably have a pretty good idea where they are. So take their financial holdings at the same time via cyber and then seizing assets. No one's going to squawk too loudly considering it's Iran and it's the United States and its allies doing it. Hopefully they're allies. If you can prevent them from accessing this fund, this cushion of funds, you would further accelerate their fracture. There's also a full internet, cellular, and landline lockdown on the country right now. Classic Iranian playbook. They turn off the internet, they turn off the cell phones. But this time, for the first time ever, they've actually turned off landlines as well. Now, 22, 23, and 24 saw tens of thousands of Starlink satellite systems smuggled into the country. They have started to jam those using mobile GPS jamming. Without GPS, Starlink can't identify its location and then can't triangulate where the satellites are, and the system just doesn't work. It has to get a GPS signal in order to broadcast, and the regime has been driving trucks through the city of Tehran and other places and, jamming the GPS signal. So the Starlinks are not working. If you can't communicate with the Iranian citizen to let them know that there's a government waiting to take over the moment the regime falls, to encourage them to continue resisting and to tell them that not necessarily who is helping them, but help is coming. This thing could stall out. If you roll the IRGC out into the street, this thing is going to be over and it's going to be pretty ugly. You've got to keep communication lines open. So this has to be patched to let people know all of these things. There's a few more scenes to this play. We're not done yet. We have laid out pretty much Act 1. So as I said previously, external strikes is really what the president has said he was going to do and what I struggled to identify how they would make a dent in the regime. And this is how you target the IRGC oil refinery complexes and only those that are controlled by the Islamic Republican Guard, leaving the rest of the Iranian oil infrastructure in place. Most of the folks that are running those are striking anyways. So Iran's oil is really slowed during these protests. If you can prevent any of those tankers from leaving Iran, this shadow fleet, that's how you target the Islamic Republican Guard. That's how you begin to fracture the regime. You sustain the protest from within and give it a couple of months. This thing could possibly work. It unites the population. The current economic misery is so deep, many protesters reportedly view any external pressure as a catalyst for change rather than an act of foreign aggression. Like one of the things that I have cautioned about attacking Iran, and my go-to sort of media-friendly soundbite has been, you're just going to rally them around the flag. It's a family that fights. As soon as somebody outside the family threatens them, everybody drops what they're doing and defends the family. But in this case, this younger generation doesn't see it that way. And that is a huge change. I mean, you could wait out the regime generationally, and in 2 or 3 generations, they're going to be gone anyways. But dude, who has the time for that? I certainly don't. So the play here, as I said, it's very simple. You strike the IRGC-controlled oil terminals, major hubs like the Kark Island or the newer Jask terminal. There's your external pressure. Meanwhile, you've got to repair and patch the internal protests' ability to communicate with the world. Meanwhile, you are bolstering the diaspora for a transitional government. So you get U.S. Department of State to handle the government transition package and the messaging, what we're doing, why we're doing it, try to build coalition support. Department of War handles the strike package. Cybercom and the U.S. cyber infrastructure at large can go after the IRGC's money, seize it, lock it down. sanction it, or whatever you want to do. And then some other unlettered agencies can help improve communications and repair internal communication nodes. Could you affect the same with a total blockade like we did in Venezuela? You could, and it is one of the options, but it's messy. It risks a failed state and a civil war, and not to mention a mass starvation. A lot of the stuff that comes into the country of Iran is stuff they can't grow. I mean, it's a lot of desert. They're not doing a lot of agriculture in Iran. There's some, but let's not forget they also have a massive water shortage. So you risk a serious starvation problem if you were to blockade the country of Iran in retaliation for what's taking place, killing and arresting all these protesters. So it's not a good look. It's not a sure thing. Even if we did strike their oil refineries, even if we did hit Iran where it hurts the most, and that's their wallet, it's still not a guarantee, but it is a tipping point you're creating, and it's possible. So what would Iran do as a reaction to strikes on the IRGC oil complex? Their shadow ports, their shadow fleets, their money. There's a couple. If they were to strike them, what most likely would happen is Iran would escalate to de-escalate. They would do it a couple different ways from what I have read, from what I've pieced together. Their playbook, Iran's playbook, is almost exclusively to conduct asymmetric warfare. No one's going to go toe-to-toe with the West, especially not the United States, especially not a country like Iran. They'll lose, and it'll be, very, very quick. There has not been a country that has gone up against us and won. Ever. You can debate Vietnam. We probably lost that, won it. That's a messy one. We'll leave that one alone for the moment. But let's stick to topic. The immediate reactions from Iran is probably to close the Strait of Hormuz, and that's going to hit financial markets, and that's going to hit financial markets hard. They would deploy a lot of speedboats, smart mines, land-based anti-ship cruise missiles, and nobody would go through. And even if you were to go through, the cost to insure for insurance for ships that are transiting would be prohibitively expensive. Nobody's going to do it. So that would drive oil prices up to $120, $130 a barrel. And they would hope to basically force the United States into a negotiation to bring the price of oil down. They would definitely rally whatever proxies are left. So Iran would ask Hezbollah, would ask Hamas, would ask anybody to attack bases in the Middle East, specifically Iraq and Jordan. But as I said, their proxies are pretty weak. So I don't know how effectively their attacks would be. I also know that our defensive posture is pretty strong, and we could probably absorb almost anything that they would throw at us. And then last would probably be cyber warfare. The Iranians engage in a pretty robust cyber attacks. And so there would be a massive attempt to retaliate against the United States, especially our financial sector and our energy grid. Those are the three most immediate reactions from Iran. But the impact on the domestic population is really the variable here. We would hope that you would have accelerated defections in the Islamic Republican Guard Corps. If the money stops flowing, the loyalty of the wallet for the lower level militia and the police could evaporate. And this is the moment that a protest could possibly turn into a revolution. You do risk nationalizing this. Foreign strikes against Iranians tend to unite them in the past. But like I said, the youth has this zero-sum mentality, and they view the regime as an occupying force, and they may cheer the destruction of the Islamic Republican Guard's money. Okay. Outside of Iran, who else is going to react? China. There they are. Told you I'd be talking about them. 90% of Iran's illicit oil goes to China. So you striking these terminals, or we striking these terminals, would essentially be striking China's energy supply line. And Beijing would likely respond with severe diplomatic and economic tit for tat. They're unlikely to intervene militarily, though. Not even China is that silly. But we would hear about it in the UN and economically. We would also probably see a lot of the shadow fleet move out in the Gulf of Oman, trying to maintain a drip of revenue while they cross-load oil to China, just to try to keep the lights on. The global reaction to the United States striking Iran would be very polarized, and it would be driven by tension between support for Iranian protesters and then fear of a global energy catastrophe. This is something that's going to drive the price of oil up. Nobody likes that. Unlike the strikes in the 2025 timeframe against their infrastructure of nukes, the hitting energy infrastructure impacts global markets. It impacts major powers like China. And that's going to have repercussions that we need to be prepared for, to absorb and respond to. But that's a problem for the diplomats to worry about. Okay. I think that China would probably use its position at the UN Security Council and call for immediate sessions to condemn the United States. I don't give a fuck. I really don't. They might also accelerate de-dollarization efforts with partners as a retaliatory economic measure, and it would hurt. But again, I don't really give a fuck about that one. They may try to place some leverage in some other areas, Beijing, using some proxies, but that's really going down the rabbit hole and being wonky. So let's just leave it as diplomatically, they would scream. They would still try to get some oil out of Iran, although small, though it may be. Iran's reaction would be a very delicate one. Sorry, Europe's. The EU, I think, secretly wants Iran off the board, but they don't want to be the ones that are participating in it. So they have already added a lot of snapback sanctions in 2025 due to the nuclear noncompliance. So I think publicly they're going to support the intent of weakening the IGRC, especially amidst the crackdown that's taking place in the protesters. But especially Paris and Berlin would be very terrified of a regional war, likely call for restraint. They don't want IGRC to close the Straits of Hormuz because that's going to send European oil and gas to record highs. No country wants that. There's also a huge concern about refugees when we talk about doing something like that. Europe fears that a total regime collapse without a plan is going to lead to a massive migration crisis, just like we saw in Syria in 2015. Israel and the Gulf states, oh man, Tel Aviv would likely be the most vocal supporter of this. They're all about it. Final blow needed to dismantle the axis of resistance. It's been a banner year for the Israelis, considering Syria, Gaza, not weighing in, not making a value judgment, just putting it out there. And then so Iran, yeah. And then if they could knock Hezbollah off the throne in Libya, oh my God. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their reaction would be probably quietly supportive, but very publicly cautious. They are most vulnerable to Iranian retaliation because of U.S. bases that we have over there. And the U.S. doesn't necessarily provide a security umbrella, so that we would need to help protect their oil facilities. They're going to distance themselves. But I think privately they would be thrilled as well. That whole part of the world they're not happy with Iran. They're very destabilizing. A lot of these countries, they live and die on the oil revenue. And when that is upset, when that's destabilized, and markets are in flux, it hits these countries hard. They don't have any other real export. Most of the world's reactions to an attack on IGRC's oil infrastructure is going to be at the gas pump, because there's going to be probably an immediate spike in Brent crude to $100, $120 a barrel. That's going to be felt at the pump. We talked about insurance. Ships transiting the Persian Gulf their insurance rates would skyrocket. It would potentially halt commercial traffic even before a single shot is fired. If we attack the oil refineries, I would see ships stuck in their ports, anything that's transiting the Persian Gulf. And that would drive inflationary pressures globally. It would in Egypt. Food prices would skyrocket, and it would affect shipping to the U.S. as well. Most of this reaction is tempered by the U.S.'s ability to prove that the terminals were specifically used to fund IGRC, and by extension, a crackdown on the protesters. Okay, end of Act 2. So let's take a quick intermission here. Fill your glass. And while you're doing that, I'm going to digress for just a brief moment, because if you remember, the U.S. published a revised national security strategy. It called for a pivot to the Western Hemisphere. It wanted to shift burdens to the EU for a lot of the NATO responsibilities that we had. And it wanted to avoid protracted wars. It wanted to avoid regime change and nation building, both of which, well, at least regime change, we're tacitly discussing. We publicly stated we don't care anymore. And so what's changed? Why should we care what happens in Iran? Well, under the current administration, the United States' interests in Iran has shifted from containment to confrontations. Under the last administration, under the Obama administration, it was all containment. It was sanctions. It was no sanctions. It was, we want you, to broker a nuclear arms deal. We don't. And that's gone away with the Trump administration. For Washington now, striking the IRGC's economic arteries it's no longer just about regional politics. It's about addressing 4 high-stakes threats to the United States. The first one is stopping the nuclear proliferation. As I mentioned, that Iran has kicked out the inspectors. We have no idea what their enrichments are. And we have told them 0. You don't get any. You don't need to enrich uranium past, 3-4% for a civilian reactor program. So why are you enriching anything beyond that? But they've kicked out the inspectors. If you destroy the oil terminals, you can bankrupt the very organization that funds these scientists in Iran and the underground facility construction. Without oil cash from these terminals, the regime can't afford the electricity and the material costs required for high-level refinement. You get rid of this axis of resistance that we have labeled Hezbollah, the Houthis. They're weakened, but they still currently rely on a lot of the money that the IRGC provides. So that cash being taken away hits a lot of these proxies where it hurts the most. If they can't pay them, they lose their interest to attack U.S. bases. I mean, ideologically, a lot of these people, death to America, I got it. But death to America doesn't put food on the table. You can't live off of it. You need money. So if they can't pay them, they're not going to go rally. You are also preventing a massive human rights disaster. These protests, 2,000 people that we know of as of tonight's broadcast. That's a lot of people. The reports that I have read from Al Jazeera, a couple of other Eastern or Middle Eastern news organizations with folks on the ground, one of the few that are actually broadcasting, report hospitals are, seeing 70, 80 dead brought in at a time, 40 dead brought in at a time. And that's a lot. So, I mean, the United States still has a moral obligation to intercede when human rights violations of this magnitude present themselves. I kind of hoped we would do it in some other places as well, but, we left Afghanistan. Fuckers. So, yes, human rights are a factor. The U.S. also knows that a successful revolution in Iran would turn a 40-year-old enemy into a potential strategic partner. That realigns the entire Middle East in favor of Western interests. Now, here's the one that I love. It counters China and Russia for two huge things. Iran has become this critical node in an anti-Western bloc. 90% of the oil that they're selling goes right to the Chinese economy. By striking this, you put massive pressure on its primary global rival, China. Russia gets a boatload of drones from Iran. They're using those drones in Ukraine. You want to eliminate the supply of drones and missiles to Russia, thereby increasing Ukraine's advantage? Yeah, you go off the IRGC's revenue. It stops the production of weapons. So that one's great. Okay. Intermission's over. I hope you have a fresh glass, or at least topped up. Let's continue with Act 3. We'll finish up our thought experiment, bring this to its logical conclusion. Okay, so for all of this to work, we have to sell it to the world. First to the American people, then the rest of the planet. So if you remember last week, we didn't ask for permission or beg forgiveness to take Maduro. This isn't the same, and it's not going to play out the same. The question of whether or not the United States should care about the international opinion, it's a point of debate between the realists who focus on power and the institutionalists who focus on cooperation. And now, from a purely military point of view, the U.S. can act alone. We don't need any coalition formed. This is not the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where Bush put together this huge coalition. It's not the first Gulf War, where his father did the same. This is a pretty simple strike package conducted with organic assets that are forward deployed and ready to go right now. But from a strategic and economic perspective, ignoring the world costs a lot. It could undermine the very goal of the strike, and here's why. The energy blowback is going to be huge. China and the EU will view the strike as unprovoked aggression, and if we don't get their buy-in, they won't help stabilize oil markets. All countries have strategic oil reserves, and in crisis, they release those strategic oil reserves. Biden did it last year when the price of gas got too high. No existential threat, just an internal one. He caught a lot of flack for that. I have an electric car. I don't really care what you do, but the U.S. needs those global partners to keep shipping lanes open, to keep the price of oil low. If the world stops cooperating and oil hits $140 a barrel, well, then we're going to feel it at the pump. And I don't know if you know this, but we're in a midterm election cycle. That is the quickest way to be voted out of office. If you are in Congress, price of gas goes up to $6, $7 a gallon, which it could easily do. Legal and diplomatic isolation. Without a UN mandate, or at least a broad coalition of willing partners, it makes the U.S. look like an outlier. And this allows China and Russia to frame the U.S. as a rogue superpower. It makes it harder for Washington to build alliances in the future on other instances like Taiwan and Ukraine. So you don't have to spend a lot of political capital or diplomatic effort to get these countries to go along. You can do it relatively quickly. And let's be honest, that is the one thing that President Trump is fairly good at, is picking up the phone and telling people what they're going to think. And then stability after the regime falls. If it actually topples, we don't want to be the only ones that owns the resulting chaos. Without international support, the United States will be solely responsible for humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, and rebuilding. It's kind of a you break it, you bought it attitude. We saw that in Iraq in 2003, and it sucked. We and just a couple of minor partners were left putting the country back together. Anyways. Okay. Well, this is the Trump administration, so let me at least throw out a couple of reasons why we might not care. The national interest doctrine, right? Current administration has an America First policy, and it suggests if a target like Iraq, Iran, why do I get them confused? I don't know, because they both start with the letter I? I'm not sure. Countries like the IRGC are a direct threat to U.S. security. The administration's just going to hit them, and they're not going to ask permission. And the UN's thought and opinion is irrelevant. Washington may calculate that the world will complain publicly, but I think privately they're going to be relieved. And a lot of Arab countries and European countries want the IRGC gone. They just don't want to be the ones to take the blame for it. So the United States may just decide to take the hit for a 40-year problem. We have a huge amount of leverage over China by doing this. It might intentionally ignore China's protests. And in this case, the view isn't just about striking Iran. It's a demonstration of U.S. power to disrupt the energy supplies of its biggest global rivalry. There's a middle ground, though, and it's the one that I hope is taken, and it's really justified unilateralism. This really is just a lovely scotch. I know I champion bourbon so much, but I just have this peaty Islay. Anyways, the U.S. typically tries to care just enough to maintain a moral high ground. And in 2026, the strategy would likely to be to frame the strikes as humanitarian intervention. I think that's the best play. Say to the American people, we aren't striking for oil. We are striking to stop the IRGC from using oil money to buy the bullets they're using on their own people. Now, that's a media-friendly soundbite that will sell papers. That's a headline right there. And that, caring just enough to maintain the moral high ground, it works. If you can link a military strike to the internal protests, then the U.S. will make it very difficult. Make it difficult for the world to condemn our attack. Because we're seen to be supporting the strikes, the strikers, the protesters. Yeah. But really the ultimate reason the U.S. cares is simple. It's sustainability. It's easy to start a war alone. It's almost impossible to finish one and build a lasting peace without the rest of the world. So we need them. We need them. We don't have to have everybody all in. It doesn't have to be a months-long debate in the UN. It's really 24 hours of phone calls between Secretary of State, between President Trump, between J.D. Vance, between Hegseth. In a lot of cases, just pick up the phone. And I think you'll, in short order, get at least a tacit approval for striking. Yeah. So that's it. That's the 3-act play. It's possible that the time you read this or listen, that this has been put into place. I think that this is the domino that you could tip that would end with the Iranian theocratic regime being displaced and a ostensibly democratic replacement put in. Yeah, I would say possibly by the time you finish your spring cleaning, there could be one less country shouting death to America out there. And what a refreshing change of tone that would be in that part of the world. So I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope it has given you something to think about. I hope it has educated and illuminated some things that maybe you hadn't. Wait, hold on. Oh, I hear you. Yeah, there's a protester outside and holding up a sign. I'm told that the individual wants me to discuss the counter arguments for attacking. Lame. I wasn't really going to. I was going to leave it right there. but I do have a little more scotch left in my glass. And I guess it would be pretty one-sided not to offer a counter argument. So, okay, I'm going to run through it. What is the argument against striking? Well, you've got a couple counter arguments, I would imagine. Most seasoned military and diplomatic analysts say that striking the oil terminals could be a catastrophic success. Weird turn of phrase. Catastrophic success achieves a short-term military goal while creating a long-term disaster for the United States and the Iranian people. So here's a couple of examples, and I got to say one of these is already starting to manifest itself. The Iranian Defense Council recently signaled it may not wait to be hit. If the U.S. even mobilizes for a strike on the terminals, the IRGC might preemptively launch missile barrages against U.S. bases or regional oil hubs in Saudi Arabia to deter the attack. News reports have said as much very recently. I read 2 articles today where they have said, if we even think you are winding up to punch us, we're going to attack. And that's a real threat. I would not be surprised at all if security postures outside the United States, especially military installations in that part of the world, are in a pretty high alert state right now. The other thing that is a counter argument for attacking IGRC oil terminals is the civilian factor. A lot of experts warn that a cornered IRGC, unable to find a traditional military or fund it, they may attack entirely state-sponsored terrorism, go strikes against aviation, shipping, to prove it can still inflict global pain. There's a lot of capability for the IGRC to bring down civilian airliners, to target civilian ships, to detonate small boats, suicide attack style. And they may just lash out in dozens of different ways. There still could be this national rallying around the flag that takes place. A lot of people don't think that it's going to happen at this time and place in this unique moment in Iranian history, but it still is out there. Nobody knows exactly what that's going to happen. Historically, even those who hate the regime resent when foreign powers attack or destroy their country's national wealth. But we got a small snapshot of the Iranians' reaction, the Iranian on the street, not the regime, when we attacked their country in summer of last year. It was not the national backlash that we thought it was going to be. But you don't know. A strike could force moderate elements with the Iranian military to unite with the IRGC to defend the nation. They're not doing that right now. There is a standalone Iranian military separate from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And as I've mentioned, the two of them are somewhat independent. This could bring them together. You also have this huge power vacuum that could be left. If the transitional government is not ready and the regime falls, man, there is going to be a massive civil war, a total collapse of the regime, and a massive chaos. It really kind of looks like Syria in this instance without a centralized government in waiting. You could have ethnic separatist groups, military factions, and this could lead to a decade of civil war and a massive refugee crisis for Europe. So that's another argument against it. We also have the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, the nuclear question. So if the regime suddenly collapses, control over these remaining nuclear materials and the ballistic missile sites, it becomes uncertain. Kind of like when the former Soviet Union fell and it fractured all of these weapons stockpiles into various satellite locations. This creates a nightmare scenario of loose nukes in a fractured state. And the U.S. is not immune to the fallout of its own strikes. Oil markets, like I said, Strait of Hormuz, pushing oil prices up. This would tank the president's approval rating if gas goes to $7 a gallon. Yeah. We definitely rupture our supply lines with China. Beijing could unleash economic warfare, total breakdown of the U.S.-China relations, possibly retaliatory trade blockades. This whole thing hinges on whether or not the United States administration believes that the moral and strategic reward of a free Iran outweighs the economic and the military risk of a regional war. A strike could be the final push these protesters need. It carries the risk of a catastrophic success that leaves the Middle East in a decade of stability. My prognosis for the next 7 days is, and I'll stand by it, I think we're going to strike. I do. I know that the administration is bold. I think they're already wargaming scenarios beyond what I have talked about. And I think within a week, something is going to be put into place by this administration to help the tipping point. I don't know what that's going to involve. It's probably not going to involve Israel, because I think any attack by Israel on Iran really inflames a lot of the neighboring countries just from an ideological standpoint. But it might. It was not as bad in 2025 as people forecasted it would have been. We may see past as prologue. Tonight, several thousand Iranian citizens are dead. The country of Iran is in upheaval, and there's a genuine threat against a long-standing theocracy that is militant to its core. My heart goes out to you, Iranians. Not that you're going to listen to my little show, but for what it's worth, fight the good fight and earn your freedom. We all had to. It is fed with blood, our tree of liberty. So with that, I will leave you as I finish my last wee dram. Thank you for listening to this special edition of the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition. That has been your Iranian brief for the 11th of January, 2026. Until next time, stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.